The following is a presentation from the 9th Annual Humanities Days at Montgomery College. The Human in Humanities, Understanding Ourselves and Others. This year we offered 30 remote events via Zoom. To learn more about Humanities Days at Montgomery College and to access other program recordings, please go to this website.
Welcome to the 9th Annual Humanities Days at Montgomery College. My name is Sarah Ducey, and I'm your host today for our program, which is called Traditional African Art, Understanding a Changing World. I'd like to tell you a little bit about our guest speaker today. We have Professor Ken Jassie, who is a long-term member of our art department faculty here at the Rockville campus of Montgomery College. He is also the art history coordinator for that program. Previously, he has served as a lecturer at the National Gallery of Art and with the Smithsonian Associates. With Smithsonian Associates, he was particularly interested in lecturing on topics such as Van Gogh and also on Chinese archaeology and on the ABCs of African art. He is the designer and the creator, if you will, the inspiration behind our course Art 270, which is the survey of African art. And next fall, he will be offering that course again in person, if all goes well. One of his favorite museums in the District of Columbia is the National Museum of African Art, and you'll hear from Ken about why that's so. So welcome, Ken Jassie, to our program, Traditional African Art, Understanding a Changing World.
Thank you, Sarah, for the thoughtful introduction. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, Professor and Jassie. Hi.
Hi. Okay, let me start by saying that the lecture is not meant to be a definitive statement about African art, rather an opening statement, a beginning, an encouragement perhaps to learn more, to study the subject in greater depth, maybe even take my class in African art. In discussing African art, it is not so simple as scrolling through images and making straightforward art historical remarks. There are issues in general when it comes to studying a culture different from our own, specifically when it comes to looking at art objects from Africa. There's a tendency pronounced among Westerners to gaze at the other through the lens of our own preconceptions. And again, specifically in the case of Africa and African art, the problem is made harder by the fraught history of the slave trade and colonization that created a vision of Africa as primitive and dysfunctional, and fostered by the current media of modern Africa as a place of constant disaster. Additionally, the practice of placing African artifacts in natural history museums rather than art museums, the self-serving use of objects by Western artists like Picasso and Matisse make it very difficult to be objective and fair. So, for example, the image on the screen is a crest mass from the Cross River region, which is partly Nigeria and partly in Cameroon. And if we look at this object, which looks positioned as it is as a fairly lifelike looking sculpture with elegant curves and spiral designs. But that doesn't tell us all that much except as an isolated object, something you'd see in a museum, like in the National Museum of African Art. But doesn't tell us very much about what it really is and what it's for. And so we have to go a little bit more deeply. Collectors often refer to these type of cross river masks as skin masks. Don't worry, the skin is from animals, typically like an antelope or a goat. It would also very likely have actual hair as well. But this is something that would be worn, as a crest mask on top of the head. You just think of mask over the face, but in this case, it's worn on top of someone's head during an important ceremony, initiation or a funeral, and so forth. It represents a married woman and the kind of elaborate and elegant hairstyle worn by a woman of some importance and status, and the image is idealized, so it represents a kind of ideal of beauty. So already we can see that to start to make some sense about African art involves talking more about context, and that's something that that we're certainly going to be doing. A word about Africa. We have to be careful about generalizing when it comes to African art, when it comes to Africa. You see from this map or from the next map, it's composed of many different countries, 12 million square miles of land, dozens of language groups, almost uncountable variety of religions, small villages, modern cities, etc. We can say that we can, make a generalization about Africa as a geological fact, that is having a geological history, but culturally speaking, not as a single unified entity. That is, again, we have to look at particular cultures and not just make sweeping statements about Africa as a whole, because that's very problematic. So I want to spend a little time talking about the Chura crest, which was created by an artist from the Bamana people in Mali, and actually southwestern Mali, parts of Guinea and Senegal. And want to talk about the Chura and then lay out some of the issues. I will say that Chura is one of my favorite objects, and that's true of many people. And it's certainly something that we could discuss in terms of formal beauty. Its sleek curves, its rhythm of geometric patterns, contrast of proportions between the head and the body of the object. And it's fine to appreciate a beautifully created, carved object. But that's not enough. And that would be a purely academic exercise. and an ethnocentric enterprise, if you will. And it wouldn't tell us anything about what it is, and more importantly, what it's for. And so we need to take a more deeper approach, more anthropological, sociological approach as much or more than art historical or together, and look something at the society that produced it. Apparently, excuse me, there's no word for art in the Mande language in the Western sense. So when we start talking about art, we already come up against a barrier. The closest approximation for art denotes a figure made of wood, which doesn't tell us that much, and certainly doesn't take the idea that this is an aesthetic thing. These objects traditionally were made by a caste of carvers, usually sort of generation after generation of people would be tasked with making objects for the use of the community. With wood and metal objects, it was generally men. For ceramic objects, it was more often women. And these objects were made following sort of prescribed methods and particular materials and tools. But that doesn't mean they were everywhere the same among the Bamana people. If we look at a couple of other examples of the Chura. The typical ones you usually see in Western museums, like the one I just showed you, that kind of vertically oriented one, generally come from the villages in the East. The more horizontal oriented Chihuahua from communities in the North, and the more abstract ones, like the one on the right from the Southwest. So there are a series of regional varieties, and that's something that that we need to also take into account. Let me go back. In other words, the artists or craftsmen were interested in continuing cultural traditions rather than making art for art's sake. In the Western idea, which in Mali would be considered useless. The artists were respected, but not part of particularly high status profession. Today, the objects like the Chihuahua are still being produced, although generally now for collectors and tourists rather than for the original purpose, which I want to talk about more now. So the Chihuahua is a carved object, but it's also a ceremony and a social organization. Chi refers to farming, and Wara to a wild animal. And you can see that it certainly represents an animal form, albeit in an abstract sense. The Chihuahua is part of a Bamana creation story in which a primordial creature, again, nothing that exists in the world, is sent by the creator to teach human beings how to farm, which was the Bamana was the basis of the local economy. And the imagery within it, whether of the different regional varieties, represents animals which are associated with digging in the ground, analogous to a plow, such as the antelope with its horns, an aardvark with its snout, and a kind of wild dog, which represents the sort of horizontal part of the body. So it's not a particular animal. This is a creature from the mythical past, which refers to how things began. And the Chihuahua was not made, except for more recent times and in museums, as a display object. But rather it was used in the Chihuahua masquerade ceremony. In that term, masquerade, sounds, when you use it in English, it sounds more like a sort of Halloween party, but is really part of a spiritual tradition. And you can see that the Chihuahuas are a crest mask on top of the head. And then you have a whole other costume of darkened fibers, which disguises the wearer. Now, people would only see the Chihuahua crest during these occasions. It was not an art object for display. When it was not being used in a ceremony, it was not seen. And that is a sort of different way of experiencing art. And when it was seen, it was something being used in a very active way, involving movement and in front of an audience in which there was some interaction. So the masquerade itself, and let me show you another image as well, because you can see here in this view that people are present there. Part of it is a kind of theatrical reenactment of the creation story that I mentioned. Let me go back. You can see that the people involved would sort of make to sort of dig in the ground and bring their heads down and then back up as though they're working to plow the land. And in a way, this is partly to inspire people to do the work, to do the farming, to feed the community, and to the Chihuahua ceremony would take place during planting season, and it would entertain, but also represent the centrality of the family in the Bamana community, usually done in pairs to represent sort of a man and a woman and a child, and that their role. Chihuahua also refers to a social organization whose task was to train young men in the community from roughly from adolescence to adulthood. And while there, these young men would have learned the rudiments of farming. And also part of the organization was to act sort of like matchmakers, to pair the young man with a young woman to marry and to continue the traditions of the community. And this goes along and is reinforced by the masquerade itself. And there, with the masquerade during planting season encourages young men to go to the field and to plow the earth as tirelessly as possible, and to be cheered on by others in the community, including by young women. And so all of these sort of elements, social organization, and the Chura and the masquerade are about continuity, and about sort of reaffirming traditional roles. But as we know, and as we'll be talking more about, the cultures change, something that's inevitable. The Chihuahua masquerades were popular among the Bamana until the 1950s, and then started to give way as a result of economic and technological and religious changes. And as something in a culture becomes less useful, it tends to change or to give way to something else. And so there's a shift away from the masquerade. And then, as I mentioned, carvers found new markets in response to changing times, making Chihuahua and other objects for export. Another group of people in Mali who have been often studied and remarked upon in the context of traditional African culture is the Dagon people, who are sometimes described as being in central Mali. It's sort of more central and east near Burkina Faso. And a very long time ago, about 500 years ago or so, Dagon settled in and around the plateau known as the Bandiagara escarpment, which is a kind of striking part of the landscape where people would live and eke out a living during difficult times, and then come down into the surrounding area, as in more recent times, to farm and make a living. See from the distant view some of the structures built into the face of the cliffs, which represent shrines and buildings belonging to sort of elders and lineage leaders, sort of heads of some of the extended family. And the Dagon are particularly known, as we'll see, for their sculpted figures, as well as their masks and masquerades, some of which are still practiced today. Again, another view of some of those buildings, which have different shapes. Some of them are more rectangular, others more cylindrical, depending on their function. Mali became a French colony, ultimately became a French colony before its independence. And during the early 20th century, a number of French anthropologists produced a number of studies of the Dagon. A great deal of attention in this research was given to mythology and creation stories, including the idea of a creator known as Amma, helped give rise to animals and plants and twins, the Numo, who were then believed to have given birth to 8 pairs of twins, who are considered the original ancestors of the human race. And there are a lot of other stories, including the sort of origins of farming, a sort of granary falling to the earth, various tricks and plots and trouble caused by jackals and snakes and so forth. Dogon artists have created a number of these so-called primordial couples, as you can see here, which just goes by the generic name of a seated couple. And these objects have been interpreted in many ways over the years. As I mentioned, as representations of these original or primordial beings whose abstract renderings, show them as being very distant from ordinary mortals. They're sometimes looked at as expressing gender roles, as the two figures, even though they look very similar, represent a man and a woman. You can see from the rear view, the man has a container for arrows. He's represented as a kind of hunter and provider. The woman has a child attached to her back, and she's shown as a nurturing figure, and that they're part of this this sort of unified group. In addition, they've sometimes been looked at as having a kind of sacred numerology. That is, those sort of very elongated bodies and limbs are sometimes be used to sort of count parts, and they usually add up to 8. It's kind of sacred number, and again associated with these primordial twins. So there's a kind of mystical idea associated with them. And also in these elongated renderings, they bear some similarity to other peoples in Mali, including the older, from the Malian Empire, of these tubular shaped tomb figures. Let me go back a second. More recently, there has been more reluctance to attribute to objects like these all kinds of layers of meaning. And that's particularly due to some doubts that have been sown about the original research. So the early French investigators seem to base their findings on the testimony to a great extent of one person, was sometimes described as a blind old man by the name, sometimes described as a man named Ago Temeli. And subsequent studies have not backed up what some of the conclusions drawn by the early researchers who had their own biases. And it may have been a case of a person telling foreign researchers what they wanted to hear. And the fact there's a blind old man probably spoke to them of another blind old man, the ancient Greek poet Homer. And so as a result, the early studies tend to represent the Dogon as a kind of living mythic culture rather than as a living culture. And seeing the Dagon as sort of every day sort of reenacting these creation stories and acting in ways that the myths would suggest. But in fact, to Dagon people, the couples like this, which would be typically in shrines, are much more down to earth. Some writers have compared them to, it's sort of analogous to a statue of the Virgin Mary and baby Jesus, which again is not such a mysterious thing to Catholics. But rather that these objects dealt with more immediate issues, including a ceremony to call on spirits to bring rain, much needed in an arid climate, which involves sort of spraying the sculptures with water or saliva for something that is a current issue rather than reliving the myths. Masks and masquerades are a whole other area of inquiry about the Dagon, and scholars have identified more than 100 discrete masks and costumes, and the different uses that they have traditionally and more recently. Traditionally, that masquerades were the responsibility of the Awa association, and were concerned especially with death and the spirit world. Most famous are the collective funerals known as dama, which could last up to 6 days and which took place seldom, only approximately every 13 years. And this image shows a part of the dama procession. And during these elaborate ceremonies involve these masked and costumed figures. Part of what they're doing is separating the spirits of the dead from the world of the living. And that then the spirits become ancestral ones in their own world, in the spirit world, rather than remaining here, which would have been considered dangerous. And then the marking of a return to ordinary time. So as I mentioned, there are a lot of different masks. One of them is not even a mask, but it's called the Great Mask, and it's a tall 30 to 50 foot structure, actually not the one that we're looking at, even much bigger than that, which would not be worn, but would be placed by the home of a person who had died, and is meant to represent the beginning of death. And one of the part of Dagon mythology was that one of the original ancestors was turned into a snake. And hence, both in the Great Mask and also in the other mask, the Suriji, as you see, have that kind of serpentine form. And then that ancestor was turned into a snake, was killed, and so it represents the first being who died. Similar to the Great Mask is the Suriji, depicted, several of which are depicted here, which are also quite tall and long, and represent symbolically a kind of ladder or chain of being leading to the ancestors or to the spirit world. And as we'll see in the next one, that there was a way to contact them, and the mask was part of that. The person who was wearing it, and this was certainly not easy thing to do, and rather acrobatic, would sort of bend down and strike the ground with the mask, as sort of summoning the spirits, and then straightening back up. This is one way of communicating with spirits. Also using a spirit language, which is not a human language to communicate with people. And we can see some masks in the museum, and of course, it's not the same thing. We can see the sort of mask on the left, sort of more like the serpents, one on the right, more like a bird from the Bois culture. But even with the captions placed in the museum and little pictures, it's not the same. And I'm not saying anything against the National Museum of African Art, which is one of my favorites, because of the sort of interesting way that they show things and collections of things, but also because it's very quiet. And it's a really, it's not like the Air and Space Museum or the Natural History Museum, which are usually mobbed and very noisy, and it's hard to hear yourself think. The Suriji mask is often associated as a sort of male mask. I guess sort of makes sense. Other masks are associated with sort of female principle, like the Kanaga mask, which does have vertical element as well as some horizontal ones, and is also associated with a bird, the stork, and has some bearing on the idea of creation, birth, death, and rebirth. And again, it comes more to life when we see how they're used in a very active way. Again, there's the mask part of it covering the face. There's the Kanaga figure, in part human and part human-like, part animal-like, part abstract, and then the movements, very active ones that go along with it, which can only appear in certain occasions. Now, the Dhamma and other of traditional practices have largely survived as a result of the interest of outsiders, and have become what one commentator has described as tourist spectacles. And we could argue about the merits of this quote unquote selection by tourists, or by tourism. But that's a whole other issue. But in fact, the customs and the masks have always changed and evolved. And the objects are replaced or stay the same, but have new forms and meanings, rather than, again, as another writer put it, rather than there being a Western obsession with old things. So when some of these masks are not needed anymore, they're not used anymore, they're not helping in some way, they're discarded. They're not sort of preserved and displayed and things like that. And the Dagon have dozens and dozens of different masks, some of them in human form or animal form or completely abstract. And they're ones that they don't typically use for tourists, because tourists like foreigners like the traditional ones. But there's ones that they use for themselves and are involved with local issues, are less elaborate and more colorful. And these masks deal with things like health and illness, with the climate, and with foreigners, often in satirical ways, neighboring people like whom they sometimes still in conflict with, like the Fulani, the Mossi, Muslims in general, and Westerners. But the Dagon are not the only ones who include representations of outsiders in their art. Although the imagery is relatively consistent in some ways. I want to look at a couple of examples of these new costumes, which come from, in this case, the Igbo people and the Yoruba people from Nigeria, which show that the traditional practice of engaging with the modern world is not a new one, but takes on specific forms. So in certain Igbo masquerades, like the Afikpo, there are profusion of figures that are represented in masks and costumes from the past and the present. In this case, the figure represents a Westerner, an anthropologist, observing and taking notes. And someone who is foreign, who looks different, and who's literally outside the community. And some of the depictions and sort of comments about Westerners is they're sort of always writing things down, that they're not with the people and part of the community, but remain these strange outsiders. Another example, which comes from the Gungun Masquerade, another elaborate spectacle from the Yoruba people, shows a pair of people, man and woman, in European dress, and you can see some references to that in terms of clothes and wearing a watch and carrying a bag. But in this case, particularly the fact that they're touching each other, and you can see one figure here sort of covering their face. That part of the Gungun ceremony was to or is to show what is acceptable behavior and also criticize what's considered negative behavior. Thus, the Europeans are shown as overly affectionate. In some cases, the performers sort of mimic having sex in public, and it's meant to show kind of inappropriate behavior and poor morals to be discouraged in this sort of entertaining way. But overall, the masquerade's about reaffirming sort of shared beliefs and practices more generally. Okay, let me move along a little bit, because I do want to talk about the Benin Kingdom a bit. We've mainly looked at the kind of rural communities and some of the objects and ceremonies that they were involved with. But you also have large states like the Benin Kingdom, not to be confused with the modern state, the Republic of Benin, but the Benin Kingdom is centered in what's now southern Nigeria. It was established beginning in the 13th century and ruled by absolutist kings known as Oba, O-B-A. And you can see the Benin city is here. So it's this area. A print by a Dutch visitor from the 17th century gives an idea about what the Benin Kingdom was like. You can see that they're large buildings with towers. This is an urban setting, sort of modern. Has a large population, and this print in particular shows a royal procession, which you can see the almost endless line of soldiers, sort of armed men. You have retainers attending to the ruler who's on horseback, and there are also some pairs of leopards, kind of royal pets, and symbols of royal authority. And there's still the Edo royal family still exists today, but they're not political leaders anymore, rather kind of ceremonial ones. But they still have a lot of prestige, but they're not rulers. But given that they were so powerful, there's a whole lot of art, particularly made of metal, which was a royal monopoly, showing the king and members of the royal family. And it's probably not surprising that one of the kind of prestige names of the king was the Great Head. And so we have sculptures, brass sculptures, showing basically just the head and neck, considered the most important part of the body and the spiritual part. These objects, again, they have a kind of flat base, were meant to be placed on shrines, which each ruler would establish, and have objects like these, sculptures like these, and other sort of prestige objects, weapons, ivory, and other things, which also would refer back to past rulers who would have had their own shrines. These Oba heads were made over a long period of time, going back at least to the 15th century and continuing on into the 19th, early 20th centuries. And there's a evolution of them. You can see they don't look exactly the same. The older ones, like the one on the left, tend to be a bit more naturalistic. And then the one on the right, the more modern one, tends to be more abstract. And for people who've studied cultural history and art history, we know that evolutions in art aren't necessarily from sort of more crude to more natural, or from less good to better, but there are these cycles in the art. Be that as it may, these sculptures are meant to indicate wealth, whether it's the kind of the beads and other jewelry, which would have been imported. They show power, and that's true with the crown and the horns, and also beauty, as having a long neck was considered desirable. And then you have these superhuman qualities, particularly on the right, the enlarged eyes, suggesting a kind of all-seeing person. There's also a lot of artwork that represented the Queen Mother, or Iyoba, I-Y-O-B-A, who had a political role as an advisor, a trusted advisor, but also was a source of inspiration, figuratively and literally, to the king. And their sculptures represented in metal, but also in ivory. Benin artists were skilled at carving ivory. This small pendant showing an Iyoba and the identity of the position is not so much by the appearance, some extent by the crown, but by also the two vertical lines. The Oba would have more. But this object would actually be worn around on the belt of the king. Sometimes they go off into battle, that his mother is with him. Interesting also, as we look at the figures around under the chin and above the head, you have mainly two types of figures. One has a kind of tail, is more like a fish, representing the mudfish, which is associated with creation and also a powerful water deity. And then there's other figures who have beards, and they represent Europeans. Specifically, in the case of the earlier days of the Benin Empire, the Portuguese, with whom the Benin kings had an alliance and also traded with them. The Europeans were very interested in ivory, but not just the raw ivory and the elephant tusks, but carved objects, which were sometimes commissioned from Benin artists for prominent patrons, including royal patrons back in Europe. From the Portuguese, Benin rulers obtained weapons, particularly things like muskets and gunpowder, which allowed them to conquer some of their neighbors and expand their empire. So the image of foreigners that appears here is more positive and represent sort of like a talisman, like a good luck charm or a protective motif in the art. Well, the relationship between the Europeans and this sort of relatively reciprocal relationship between the Portuguese and the Benin Kingdom changed dramatically during the 19th century. What historians sometimes call the scramble for Africa between roughly 1870 and 1914, when European powers would end up by the end of that time controlling about 90% of Africa. And the British were the power that colonized Nigeria, and the independence of the Kingdom of Benin came to an end as a result of the infamous British punitive expedition of 1897. And in brief, an English official wanted to meet with the Oba, but was asked not to do so during the time of a religious festival. He went anyway, and his party was ambushed and many people were killed. The response was a raid by 1,200 British soldiers and sailors against Benin City, which was captured, and the royal palace complex and its shrines were looted, not to mention an unknown number of people who were killed. The photo that you see, that famous photo, shows soldiers posing proudly with their loot, ivory, and the statues and other things. One soldier noted in his diary that all the stuff of any value found in the king's palace and surrounding houses has been collected. The plunder was taken back to England, where some of it was kept by individual soldiers. The most impressive objects went to the British Museum, where they remain, including so-called Benin bronzes, carved ivory and sculptures, and lots more were sold off to private collections and museums around the Western world. I want to have some time for questions, so let me just go ahead a little quickly with this part. Image is the so-called Benin bronzes, although they're misnamed. They're actually made of brass, and there has been some talk and some action about what to do with Benin bronzes and other objects, and whether they should be returned as sort of state-sponsored theft. And in some individual cases, some artworks have been returned, including by Mark Walker, whose grandfather, Captain Walker, took part in the raid in 1897. And Walker returned 2 small objects that were in the possession of his family directly to the Oba. He went back to Nigeria. saying that these objects should just go back. It's the right thing to do. Some others have followed suit, and there have been some negotiations involving the British Museum, the OBA, and the Nigerian government. And as of 2020, the talk is of loaning 300 objects for an exhibition in Nigeria for 3 years, with the option to renew for an additional period. Museums in Vienna and Berlin were also talking about taking part. And on the Nigerian side, the construction of a museum in Benin City to display the artworks is underway and is supposed to be finished in 2023. So we'll see what happens with that. But given the history, does this approach go far enough to resolve historical injustice? Or put another way, does it represent closure? And I'll take some questions.
Professor Jassie, for your really remarkable presentation today, really helping us to understand much more about African art. And I think we all value that perspective about you just have to see this in context, right? You can't just hanging on the wall. It's a start, and it can be quite fantastic. And we have this wonderful museum right here in the District of Columbia as a part of the Smithsonian Museum, but we need more. I really like the way you've said it's not enough, right? And so thank you for giving us more so that we can start to go down that pathway of enough and to be more respectful and more mindful.